Hey guys, I'm Chris Buck, and a very warm welcome to Friday Fretworks. And this week, we're taking a look at the Les Paul and how slowly but surely it came to define the sound of rock and roll. To say that the Les Paul has a storied history would be something of an understatement. For a guitar that, along with the Stratocaster, is arguably the defining image of an electric guitar, it's safe to say it wasn't an overnight success, or at least a success at all actually initially, especially relative to the guitar that initiated or inspired its design, the Fender Telecaster. Rewind to NAMM in July of 1950, and Californian upstarts Fender had, although not necessarily knowing at the time, just revolutionized the world of guitar with the introduction of the Esquire, a guitar that the world would very soon know as the Telecaster, the world's first commercially available solid-body electric guitar. Critics were initially harsh, referring to it as a snow shovel, a canoe paddle, or perhaps most damningly, a toilet seat with strings. But ultimately, the guitar would prove to be at the vanguard of the electrification of music. Despite Gibson's initial skepticism at the concept of one solid bit of wood stuck to another solid bit of wood, it wouldn't be too long until they followed suit, albeit with typical Gibson finesse, flair, and design sensibilities. Gibson president Ted McCarthy's vision was to design a guitar that could not only compete with the Telecaster, but address its inherent weak points or flaws as he saw them, namely its bolt-on neck and its agricultural slab body. And thus Gibson management team, Ted himself, as well as Morris Berlin, CMI's president, Gibson parent company at the time, as well as Guy Hart, Gibson's general manager, and John Hewis, the factory manager, set about designing the as of yet unchristened solid body guitar with a carved top and a set glued neck. After much finessing of that original prototype, the guitar was ostensibly ready to launch. All that was missing was a name and someone to help promote it. Enter Les Paul. Les and his wife Mary Ford were one of the most prolific and successful acts of the day, with over 28 hits between 1950 and 1957. As such, were deemed the perfect pairing to help promote Gibson's new solid body guitar. After a trip to Delaware with the new prototype in tow, a deal was struck between Gibson and Les, not only to exclusively play Gibson guitars in public for at least the next 5 years, but an agreement to use his name on the headstock for a kickback of $5 on each Les Paul guitar sold, about $55 in today's money. The new guitar was to retail at $210, $20 more than a Telecaster of the day, Gibson very much setting their stall out as a more luxurious alternative to Fender's glorified toilet seat with strings. The icing on the cake was to be the guitar's gold finish, a suggestion of Les himself, and thus, with its new gold top finish and a trapeze tailpiece, the Les Paul was already reaching dealers by June of 1952. It was just one slight hiccup. The guitar was virtually unplayable. Following a massive miscalculation on Gibson's part in regard to the required neck angle on a Les Paul, the wrap over trapeze tailpiece, Les Paul's only actual design involvement in the guitar, had to be adapted on the fly to a somewhat ungainly wrap under trapeze tailpiece in order to not only get the strings to anything approaching a playable height, of course the trade-off then being that you can't palm mute the strings. No surprise to see that Les Paul himself changed out the tailpiece on his guitar to a Kaufman vibrato very quickly. And as such, as you can imagine, this design quirk, shall we call it, massively hampered sales when the guitar was released. Gibson tried to quickly rectify the playability issues with the introduction of a wrap over tailpiece, as well as a change of neck angle in late 1953, just in time for Fender to introduce the Stratocaster, another seminal moment in guitar history. And unsurprisingly, the runaway success of both the Tele and the Strat would continue to hamper Gibson's sales of their new Les Paul, despite their best efforts, it's worth saying. In the fall of 1955, there was another change of tailpiece to the new adjustable ABR1, as well as a change in 1957 to their new PAF pickups, patent applied for humbuckers. But by 1958, Gibson were ready to write off the Gold Top as a bad job, the final roll of the dice being the introduction of the new Sunburst standard Les Paul. Alas, while the Stratocaster went from strength to strength in the hands of the likes of Buddy Holly and Hank Marvin, it's estimated that only around 1,700 Les Paul Burst standards were produced between 1958 and 60. And as such, in late 60, Gibson called time on the rather tumultuous 8-year run, the initial run of the Les Paul, a rather inauspicious start and finish for a guitar that would go on to be one of the most famous of all time. So what happened? As much as the Les Paul story undoubtedly starts in the early 1950s, you could make a very strong case that it didn't truly get going until the mid-1960s, when a young Eric Clapton would plug in his 1959 Les Paul Standard into a cranked Marshall JTM 45, thus giving birth to the sound of rock guitar as we still know it today. That Bluesbreaker record was a truly seismic moment. I actually made an episode about it recently if you want to check that out, I'll link above. Needless to say, would send guitarists the UK over, scuttling to try and find their own Les Paul standards, amongst which, notably Peter Green and Jeff Beck, while on the other side of the Atlantic, a young Mike Bloomfield and a young Billy Gibbons would also set about trying to track down one of these old Les Paul standards that seem to be making so many waves in the UK. This massive surge in interest in the now out of production Les Paul, it's worth remembering, typified by none other than Keith Richards using one on the Stones' appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, would clearly catch the attention of Gibson because in 1968 they proclaimed, "Okay, you win," as they reissued the Les Paul, albeit in its rather lesser spotted custom guise, as well as a 56 spec P90 gold top. Clearly riding the crest of a wave, throughout the late 60s and 1970s, the Les Paul would continue to be at the forefront of popular music, with anyone from the likes of Deep Breath, Jimmy Page, to Paul Kossoff, to Billy Gibbons, to Eddie Van Halen, To Leslie West, to Randy Rhoads, to Ace Frehley, to Joe Perry, to Lindsey Buckingham, to Gary Moore, to Scott Gorham, to Alex Lifeson, to Bernie Marsden, to Jan Ackerman, to Steve Hackett, to Mark Bolan, to Pete Townsend, to George Harrison, to Dwayne Allman, to Mick Taylor, to Mick Jones, to Frank Zappa, Mick Ronson, to Neil Young, to a young Peter Frampton putting the Les Paul to incredible use. Incidentally, I have to mention it, that in November of this year, Cardinal Black, my band, will actually be supporting Peter Frampton on his UK farewell tour. I'll stick all the relevant links to that tour and our own headline tour in September 22, if you're watching this on Dave Plus One, down in the description box. Safe to say that the 1970s really cemented the Les Paul's reputation as the rock musician's guitar of choice, with even Fender trying to chase down that Gibson sound with the introduction of the wide-range humbucker, introduced in 1970. But perhaps it's because this coincided with the dark days of Gibson's gnawing ownership and its associated drop in quality, or maybe it was just changing musical tastes. But by the mid-1980s, Gibson found themselves on the precipice of bankruptcy, and it would ironically take a fake Les Paul to save them. It was while managing Guns N' Roses in 1986 that a good friend of mine, Alan Niven, would stop by Take One Studios in Burbank to see how Slash was getting on with the overdubs on Guns N' Roses' debut record. And upon arriving at the studio, found the band's rental van's windscreen complete with a Gibson SG poked through it, headstock first, at which point Alan clearly guessed that Slash was still having problems finding a tone that he was happy with. Alan called by a guitar shop that he knew, Music Works, and would come away with a 59 Les Paul Replica made by LA luthier Chris Derrick, a guitar that would go on to pave the foundations for not only one of the biggest selling rock albums of all time, but would lay the way for the second Les Paul revival. Slash would officially retire that guitar from touring only 3 or so years later in 1989, but his near-monogamous relationship with the Les Paul in the years since was no doubt crucial in bringing Gibson back from the precipice of financial disaster. Not for the first time, it's worth mentioning, but it's great to see that in recent years especially, there's been not only a resurgence in the interest in Gibson instruments, but a marked increase in quality in the output, not only in terms of guitars, but their online stuff like the Collection series on YouTube, which is brilliant if you've never watched it. They've had the detractors and undoubtedly the odd misstep here and there, but there's no denying that the Les Paul truly is integral to the sound of rock and roll, and arguably one of the greatest guitars ever made. I'm Chris Buck, you're watching Friday Fretworks. Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe, hit the bell icon if you haven't already, and I shall see you next week for another episode. Cheers guys, take care, see you soon.